Prova, prova. Puoi provare. Quick. Accendi il giallo. Prova.
Hello, test. Hello. Can you hear me? That seems.
Prova, prova. Il microfono, questo è il microfono gelato.
Sí. Ok. Muy bien. Buongiorno, ecco oggi rispetto a ieri l'audio è certamente migliore. Allora, siccome ci sono dei posti liberi qui avanti, se qualcuno vuole accomodarsi qui è meglio perché abbiamo costruito, quindi abbiamo riorganizzato questa sala proprio per una maggiore vicinanza. Quindi chi dei posti dietro vuole venire avanti ci fa una gentilezza. Piano uno alla volta. Gentile, grazie. Eccoci. Benissimo, allora cominciamo questa seconda giornata e che dedichiamo alla presenza di Silbrucio, che è per la prima volta qui a Udine e sapete essere uno dei maggiori esperti in questo momento di un trattato di cui nel nostro paese si sta parlando pochissimo, mentre invece in Europa ha determinato anche dibattiti molto accesi, addirittura con manifestazioni di piazza rispetto a che cosa sta determinando un accordo che in larga parte non si svolge su piani pubblici e al contrario si svolge invece in stanze riservate, toccando argomenti che sono importantissimi. Noi in questo momento stiamo parlando di Schengen rispetto all'incapacità di trovare una posizione unitaria o comunque umanitaria dell'Europa rispetto all'immigrazione. Ma non è solamente la mobilità, la libertà di mobilità delle persone quella che segna la vita, segna le nostre vite, e anche la mobilità delle merci, e la mobilità delle idee, la brevettazione della mobilità che permette appunto una relazione tra paesi, tra sistemi diversi, ma questa non necessariamente è una libertà che deve essere intesa in maniera irregolata. Questo è l'argomento di cui ci parlerà oggi il Presidente Bush con lui in dialogo, in dialogo Emanuele Ferragina, che è una parte scientifica di queste 5 giornate che a Udine la Camera di Commercio dedica alla ricostruzione dei sistemi politici, partendo da un presupposto, da un malessere, che singolarmente, anche solo in termini emotivi, come cittadini percepiamo, l'inadeguatezza del sistema distributivo. Sentiamo tutti, giorno per volta, concentrandoci talvolta su alcuni singoli aspetti della nostra esistenza, per l'economico, per i giovani che sono qui in sala con il loro futuro, per quello che riguarda gli imprenditori, la crisi, per quello che riguarda noi come cittadini rispetto all'arretrarsi dello Stato e inevitabile della spesa pubblica da una serie di campi su cui noi eravamo invece abituati a trovare la mano pubblica attiva. Questa insoddisfazione, questa percezione di inadeguatezza è probabilmente il segno di un sistema che è arrivato a un punto di mutamento. Qualcuno sostiene di collasso, qualcuno sostiene semplicemente di aggiornamento. In questi giorni stiamo cercando di comprendere questo e di questo parleremo. Passerei la parola a Emanuele Ferragina per introdurre sul conosce, sentiremo una relazione a parte si conosce e poi un dialogo tra loro. Grazie ancora e buona giornata.
So it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and this is not because I'm an expert in what we're going to talk about. So I'm very pleased to have here one of the scholars who has invested his time on this very tricky and new issue of is interesting about that, and I think what Gabriel will show you, it is something. When we're talking a lot, we're using a lot of the word future. Well, I think compared to everything we're going to discuss these days, this meeting of this morning is exactly about future, because what might happen as an outcome of this treaty might fundamentally change our lives. And one of the big issues we have in Italy is our parochialism. We are very bind to our own political life and the discussion of our small things. Then there are big changes that are happening around us that fundamentally change our life, that we don't question, that we don't understand, that we just, we get in without any critical thinking. So I'm very pleased to have here Gabriel because of this specific issue, but also because Gabriel is a great scholar. Despite his young age, Gabriel has a lot of achievement and an incredible intellectual journey. I'm sure the best is to come. So Gabriel, as a traveler, is a great traveler. Like this morning, we were talking about his childhood across many countries. He's born in Germany, but grew up in Spain, lived in Morocco, moved to Brussels, loves Italy, and then studied in the United Kingdom. So he first did his undergraduate studies at University of Warwick, followed by a master's degree and a PhD at University of Sheffield, which, just for people who might not know, it's probably the most interesting department of political science in the United Kingdom, evaluated on the top of the UK list. So in my opinion, even best. And then Gabriel moved to Oxford Brookes as a lecturer, then to Manchester, and then as a future was invited back again to the University of Warwick. So I don't say more. He has published the only comprehensive book about these burning issues we will talk about. He's also published an article on all things you can find online. But again, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emanuele, for the very kind introduction. And likewise, thank you very much, Renato and Omar, for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be in Udine. It's a real pity I couldn't stay until this afternoon, because I would love to explore the region a little bit more. It's a fantastic city. I had a chance to walk around it last night, and I was really blown away, particularly by your city hall. It's spectacular. As Emanuele has said, what I'm going to do today is very brief as I can present some of the findings of a book which I wrote together with my colleague Bernie Miller from the University of Ghent in Belgium. And the book has a rather, unfortunately, bombastic title. A lot of debate about it is bombastic. And in this sense, hopefully you'll take the title, which is The Truth About Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, with a pinch of salt. I'm not claiming to have the truth about TTIP. But it's sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek remark about the fact that a lot of people do think about this free trade agreement that's currently being negotiated between the EU and the United States. And in a sense, what we're trying to do with this book is navigate a very polarized field, one where emotions run high, claims are made, counterclaims are made. And I understand it's not yet a big debate in Italy, but in places like Germany and the UK, it really does get people quite riled up. All you have to do is go on Twitter and see some comments that are made about TTIP. And in a sense, a lot of these comments are made without thinking really about what the consequences of this agreement might be. And what we are trying to do with this book is trying to cut through some of things. And now for a bit of perspective. I should say that I'm really glad to see so many people here, and shout out as well to the people who are in the spillover room watching you. I'm really honored that so many of you have come to hear me talk about this. I should say that only a few years ago I was doing research on EU trade policy. I was lucky to get 5 academics in a dusty room Tuesday afternoon. So I'm really glad that you've all come out. You obviously find it interesting enough to sacrifice a couple of minutes. So what are we trying to do with the book? I said that the debate about TTIP is very polarized. So on one hand, you have the people who are advocating for the trade agreement, people like the European Commission, your government, most other member states, very much pro-TTIP, and they have 2 arguments in favor of this agreement. One is to say that, this is basically a silver bullet for Europe's economic woes. It's a way to generate growth and jobs in a time of austerity without having to spend a single euro cent. It's free growth because what we're going to do is just eliminate some useless barriers to trade between the EU and the United States, and that's just going to generate greater efficiency. And as a result, what we're going to have is people being employed in more competitive industries, and that's going to generate income for everyone for free without having to spend any money. Maybe a few flights for diplomats to get from one place to the other to negotiate, but that's it. Essentially free. And that, of course, in the context of austerity politics, seems quite attractive as a sort of proposition, ostensibly. The second argument that's often made in favor of TTIP is that this is really also a geopolitical agreement. It's a way for the United States and Europe, which share common values, to set the future economic standards for the global economy before it's too late, before they lose their preeminent position to the likes of China, India, and other emerging economies, right? So the idea is we come together as the EU and the US, the transatlantic economy, which is still the largest economic space in the world, and we, together determine how particular economic sectors are to be regulated before, we lose our preeminent position and before China does that. So two basic arguments in favor of TTIP. One, that it's a growth of jobs machine, and two, that it's a way of cementing transatlantic leadership of the global economy. So that's the argument in favor. The argument against that a lot of critics of TTIP have been making, and there have been very rowdy demonstrations. I think there was a demonstration in Berlin a few months ago that had over 100,000 attendees. So, it's quite considerable in some places, the sort of political opposition this is stimulated. So critics say that this is essentially a corporate power grab, a grab by big multinationals that basically fundamentally challenges domestic sovereignty, the ability of governments to regulate in the public interest and protect us from all sorts of public health risks, other social risks, and it's all about essentially dismantling or watering down regulations that exist to protect us in our daily lives as consumers, as workers, as inhabitants of the earth, as it were. So one of the images that's often been used in the German context is the idea that, as a result of TTIP, what we're going to see is imports of chickens washed in chlorine, right? So in the United States, chickens can be washed in chlorine because they're kept often in quite unsanitary conditions, which is not to say that chickens are always kept very sanitary conditions in Europe, but perhaps more unsanitary in the United States. And this is seen as somewhat distasteful by European consumers, and there's a ban on imports from chlorinated chicken. And so the argument is that TTIP would dismantle that ban. Likewise, you may have heard about scandals about genetically modified organisms, GMOs. The idea being that TTIP would again water down EU regulation on GMOs and allow more imports of them. Hormone-treated beef. You have all these sorts of images, often in the area of food safety. And the second thing that's said often about TTIP is that, this is not just going to dismantle regulations, but it's also going to give corporations a lot more power to challenge governments for the public policies they make. And what's often discussed in this context is something called investor-to-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, which is a system whereby investors can sue governments for perceived violations of their investor rights. But in the past, this has been used to challenge all manner of public policies. For example, in Australia recently, there was a case involving the tobacco company Philip Morris, which challenged the Australian government over its plain packaging policy. So the idea is, again, that plenty of nasty, but also less nasty industries could challenge government policies under an investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism if it were introduced into TTIP. So the argument against TTIP is that basically this is the end of the world as we know it. This is the end of the welfare state. It's the end of social protection. This is basically a big corporate power grab. So how do we stand in terms of these two sort of polarized positions? And it's, we are to an extent exaggerating the degree to which these positions are opposed to each other, but it is true that the debate itself hasn't really come up with a medium position, and that's what we sort of try and offer. And so on one hand, we argue in the book that TTIP is unlikely to lead to a massive contribution to growth and jobs or leadership globally on trade issues, but at the same time, it's not going to be a deregulation bonanza. It's not going to lead to the complete dismantling of the welfare state. There's all sorts of political obstacles to doing so. But rather what we are likely to see, and this is still very troubling and very worrying, and actually this is why a place like this, the FutureForum, is very, the theme of the FutureForum is ideal for this, because it's about shaping the future regulatory environment. So the provisions in TTIP themselves will not be that onerous, but what it is likely to impact is the process by which regulations are adopted at an EU level in particular, and also at a national level. And here, what it's really about is entrenching this view that regulation is bad, regulation of any sort is a barrier to trade and free markets, and it's about instituting mechanisms and processes that make it more difficult to institute any form of regulation of the economy, that is banning chemicals or regulating it in favor or to prevent climate change that may introduce a cost to business. I'll talk a little bit about that later when I talk about the details of this argument. So it's still about deregulation, but in a more subtle, if not less important way than the critics will allow. So obviously I'll spell these arguments out now, but before that, what I wanted to do was give you a bit of an overview of where TTIP comes from, what it involves specifically, because it's talked about it very much in the abstract, talked about how people perceive it, but it's good to get a sense of the chronology of it, but also the sort of general structure of these negotiations. So it's fair to say that this isn't the first time that a transatlantic free trade agreement has been contemplated. This sort of idea had been on the cards before in the mid-90s and mid-2000s, but it was abandoned because there was a lot of political opposition within Europe, or it was perceived there would be a lot of political opposition within Europe. We see this overly controversial. And so the current initiative dates back to a transatlantic summit between then President of the European Council, Herman van Rompuy, and President Obama of the United States in November 2011, where both parties agreed to establish a so-called high-level working group on jobs and growth, which was going to be composed of officials from the EU and the US, which would examine the feasibility and desirability of a free trade agreement. And that working group came out with a report in February of 2013 where they argued, and I quote, that a comprehensive agreement would bring the most significant mutual benefit. And on the back of this recommendation, the EU government and the United States government initiated negotiations in July of 2013. So the negotiations have been going on for just over 2.5 years, and the 12th round, so these negotiations are conducted in so-called rounds, which is an intensive meeting between officials of both parties in either Brussels or usually DC, but now they've started moving around the negotiations. So the last round of negotiations was in Miami. The 12th round of these negotiations is taking place at the end of this month in Brussels, and I don't know if I should say lucky enough to be able to attend, not the meetings or the negotiations themselves, but to be in Brussels. There's always a so-called stakeholder forum where you get to talk to people, so it'll hopefully be an opportunity to catch up on the current state of the talks, even though they are very slow moving. So the negotiations center on three basic pillars, right? You might remember that the EU used to be structured on a pillar basis. Again, it isn't so much anymore, but it's a good analogy to look at TTIP. And so you have the so-called market access pillar, which used to be the so-called bread and butter of trade negotiations. And here, negotiations are on eliminating tariffs, which is taxes on imports, right? So, for example, if I remember correctly, textiles are currently, if you import textiles from the United States into the EU, you pay a tax of 7% on the value of those textiles, and the idea is to eliminate those sorts of taxes. It's also about providing market access in services markets, right? So in services, of course, you don't have tariffs, but it's about making it easier for US and EU companies to provide services in each other's markets. Healthcare providers providing healthcare services in Italy, for example, or education service providers providing services in the United States, or vice versa. All manner of services, right? The services economy, of course, is a growing component of international trade as well. And then, of course, there's market access to something called government procurement, right, which is purchases by government entities. I won't go too much into detail there because, although it's an important part of the negotiations, it's not the focus of my talk here. So, on one hand, you have the market access pillar, and it's fair to say that this is perhaps not the key aspect of this negotiation, because in particular, tariffs are already very low. So, tariffs on average between the United States and the EU are in the order of about 2 to 3%. There's a few sectors like automobiles and textiles where they have a so-called peak. Tariffs are generally, quite low. 2 to 3% added cost is nothing when you compared to currency fluctuations. Those fluctuate, in the order of tens of percentage points rather than a couple. The most important part of the negotiations actually is the so-called negotiations on regulatory convergence. And this is all about making sure that the EU and the US have comparable rules and regulations for goods and services. So, you can sell, if you produce a good to a European specification or an American specification, you can can also export and produce and sell it in the US market. And this is actually where, you know, experts say most of the barriers exist to trade between the EU and the US. It's not just experts. I mean, this is, you know, one of the least controversial parts of the discussion about TTIP. It's fair to say that the biggest differences and the biggest barriers to transatlantic trade are, you know, the different ways in which the United States and the EU regulate goods and services production. So, for example, the fact that, you know, genetically modified organisms are de facto, you know, in the majority banned in the European Union, and you know, are widely available in the United States, or the fact that you have different crash tests for cars. So cars have to be produced to a different specification and tested again in the US if they're produced in Europe, or vice versa if they're produced in the United States. And it's also about making sure that the regulatory processes are, you know, more transparent, so businesses know how to get their products more aligned. Right, so this is the key part of the negotiation. It often, I think, gets missed in the discussion because much of the discussion is focused on the third pillar, which is the so-called rules pillar, and this involves setting sort of rules on trade-related issues like sustainable development. So this is about having rules in the agreement that would promote environmental sustainability and labor rights. The EU wants a chapter on energy and raw materials as well in the agreement. Intellectual property rights is a big component of the, well, maybe less big component because, of course, intellectual property rights are already relatively well protected. But the issue that's attracted most controversy is this investor-to-state dispute settlement system, which is, which is also part of this rules section of the negotiation, which is a system of private arbitration for disputes between an investor and a state. But as I was saying earlier, of the three pillars, the one to focus on really is the regulatory convergence. So negotiators have been at it for 2.5 years, and of course the negotiations have attracted a fair bit of controversy. And to an extent, I mean, I think the controversy has surprised negotiators, but you know, they were already expecting a bit of pushback, a bit of opposition when they initially launched the negotiations. There was a leaked commission working paper that said, you know, that will, you know, one of the key aspects of the battle in favor of TTIP, of the negotiations, is not just the sort of to and fro with US negotiators, but is, you know, that the public relations battle was actually going to be very important. Communicating on TTIP was going to be an essential part of getting this agreement through. And so, you know, they came up with a couple of stories, narratives that they were going to tell about how TTIP is going to be great for the European economy and for Europe's place in the world. And one of those, which I alluded to earlier, was this idea that TTIP is going to be a growth and jobs miracle, right? It's a way to generate cheap growth at a time of austerity. And if we drill into this narrative, what we find is that it's often in the early days, although the Commission stays away from these now because they've been much criticized. But there was a series of statistics that were often invoked by the European Commission as to the benefits of TTIP, which came from a series of econometric models that it had commissioned. And these spoke of annual GDP gains for the EU of 119 billion euros a year, right? So with TTIP, we're going to get 320 billion euros, right? Which translated into 0.5% of EU GDP, or to make it even more easy to understand, they came up with this figure of 545 euros extra every year for a family of 4 in the EU. And these were said to be conservative estimates, right? So, you know, it sounds great. You know, we're going to get free growth, 600 euros almost, or 550 euros almost. But if you break it down, first of all, it isn't that much, because if you break it down into weekly figures per person, what you're getting is, you know, a cup of coffee per person per week. Well, maybe in Italy too. I don't know. It's about €2.62. Maybe you can buy 2 cups of coffee for that in Udine. Maybe a couple of, maybe not a cappuccino, but maybe a couple of espressos. But either way, it's hardly very much if you think about it. And more generally, I mean, you know, apart from being a small figure, the actual statistics themselves really exaggerate. Are really built on some very problematic models that exaggerate the positive impacts of TTIP while downplaying its potentially negative impacts. And that's why the term we use in the book is that these models are an exercise in managing fictional expectations, right? Because the expectation that there's going to be growth is fictional because you can't predict the future. You know, they're creating this expectation that there's going to be massive in quotation marks growth, but again, it's very contingent on what the negotiations actually yield, and it serves to hide all sorts of problems that may arise as a result of TTIP. So, for example, you know, these models, you know, are not very very technical and actually not very transparent. So, you know, it's very difficult for people to actually dig down and challenge them. but they have been very much criticized. The so-called computable general equilibrium models, which is a very big word, but to break it down into its components, it means that you assume that the economy is in general equilibrium, which means that all supply equals all demand. So, for example, there's full employment, which of course is unreasonable to assume. And these models even have been criticized by the European Court of Auditors. But what they allow policymakers to do is, one, overblow the benefits of TTIP. So they assume a very ambitious level of liberalization between the EU and the US, particularly on the regulatory component. Right? These differences in regulation between the EU and the US that I was talking about earlier, which are the main source of differences, main source of trade costs between the two. And they assume basically that as a result of TTIP, you're going to be able to eliminate 50% of trade barriers as a result of regulatory differences between the EU and the US, right? Which is a huge amount if you assume that previous initiatives have really struggled to eliminate regulatory barriers. The most ambitious agreements of this sort were a series of mutual recognition agreements only for certification standards in a certain number of sectors. And a number of those, only 2 of those were implemented because there was domestic political opposition in the United States. So assuming that TTIP will eliminate 50% of regulatory barriers is a big ask. And moreover, the figures on which the percentage trade cost added by regulations are calculated, these are figures that come from business groups, which may have a vested interest in exaggerating the extent towards regulations, which regulations impose extra costs, right? So they're not objectively given, these figures, they're given by people with a potential vested interest. So, on one hand, you're exaggerating the benefits of TTIP by simply seeing regulations, by exaggerating the extent to which you're going to be able to harmonize regulations. And on the other hand, what you're doing is you're downplaying the potential social costs associated with TTIP. And here I don't just mean the costs of adjusting to free trade, people having to move between industries, but I'm more talking about the social costs that may arise. And I'm not saying this is necessarily the outcome of TTIP, but there are social costs that are not factored in that may arise if there is a regulatory alignment which lowers levels of protection, right? Because what this model assumes is simply that regulatory divergence, differences in regulations, say on genetically modified organisms or on chemicals, are a trade cost, and obviously if they're just assumed to be a trade cost, the so-called non-tariff barrier to trade, NTB, then of course it's desirable to eliminate those. But there may well be very, very powerful social arguments for keeping regulatory difference. If anything, it arises from different democratic choices made into territories, right? So, by reducing these differences in regulation to non-tariff barriers, what the studies are ultimately doing is contributing to a redefinition of what regulation is and what decision-making is in the public interest, and reducing that, where it leads to cost to businesses, to what in English is often referred to as red tape, just bureaucratic hassle. When actually there may be very good reasons for differences in regulation. Right? In a sense, this might sound like a bit of demagoguery, but what price, in a sense, do you put on having a clean beach or having strong rights at work being protected or your health? Is it just an extra that you're getting as a result of giving up your right to employment protection? I know there's already reforms being taken place in Italy on employment reform, but this is the sort of logic I think that's at play. So that's one argument in favor of TTIP, which we sort of take issue with. And the second is this idea that TTIP is going to allow the EU and the US to set global standards. Right? This is a sort of geopolitical argument. The argument being that the EU and the US share common values. They share a common commitment to protecting the environment, to protecting workers' rights, at least when compared to countries like China or India, right? Environmental standards and workers' rights are less well protected. And so the idea is that, while we can, what we need to do is while we still have market power, the EU and the US, for the rise of these emerging economies overtakes us, we need to set the standards for the global economy. And the idea really is that, this is a sort of a powerful argument, particularly as the economic figures have increasingly been being challenged, because it's basically saying to those who have a sort of generally progressive inclination, well, do you want to wait until China is telling us all what to do, or do you want to sort of get together with someone who we generally agree with and just, work out a good deal for workers and the environment and the public health? And of course, this idea that TTIP will allow the EU and the US to set global standards is premised on a particular vision of the way in which rules and regulations will be aligned between the EU and the US. And this is never really spelled out when people invoke this logic, but the assumption is basically that what the EU and the US will be able to do is to harmonize their standards, which is to say adopt a common standard, right? Because if you adopt a common standard, then the chances are greater that, you know, you will be able to adopt at least not lower your standard, because there would pressure not to lower standards from civil society groups, for example. And what it means is that by creating a common standard between the EU and the US, I don't know, for the regulation of chemicals, say, what you're doing is you're giving third-party exporters, an incentive to adapt their standards to this common standard, right? Because this is a big market, you have market power, you know, if people want to export to your market, they're going to have to adopt that standard. And that, as a result, you have considerable power through harmonization. But of course, this is being ruled out in most of the major sectors for TTIP, because it's politically very difficult. Because one side is going to have to give up, at least one side is going to have to give up their standard, and you know, there's all sorts of political negotiations about who should do that and so on. So harmonization, which would actually allow some degree of market power on a global scale, would allow this realization of this idea potentially of the EU and the US ruling the global economy, is actually being ruled out. So a lot of it seems like hot air. And actually what's being contemplated is something called mutual recognition. So this is the idea, which is also at the heart of the single market, it should be said in the EU, but in a slightly different form. So this idea that, you know, you basically in certain sectors recognize EU and US standards as equivalent, and therefore you allow your exporters to export under your existing standard, right? So in theory, if this was applied in a non-discriminatory fashion, and you said, well, basically any exporters to the EU and the US can just conform with one or the other standard, and then that's fine, then that might allow the EU and the US to, you know, project a degree of market power, because it would offer some sort of incentive for third-party exporters to adopt European or US standards. But what the EU and the US, I mean, if you dig in this is where you have to go into footnotes. If you look at the EU's documents for the negotiations, what they're really talking about is something called bilateral mutual recognition. So it's only EU and US exporters that would benefit. So it's from this mutual recognition. So it's a discriminatory form of regulatory convergence. And of course, there, third-party exporters really don't have much of an incentive to adopt the common standard, or adopt a US or an EU standard, because it's basically the status quo, for them. And moreover, with mutual recognition, of course, you have a potential for deregulation, because, you know, exporters can, in a sense, don't have to conform to a higher standard anymore. They can. Well, if there's a difference in the standards, then exporters, you know, can simply export under their, you know, existing standard, which may, in some cases, be lower. I mean, it's always a question of contention, but there is a potential deregulatory dynamic built in here. So, you know, ultimately, what we're saying here is that TTIP isn't going to sell out the EU and the US to set global standards, because what the model of or the mode of regulatory cooperation being contemplated is one which is the sort of lowest common denominator model, and it's not going to incentivize third parties to adopt standards, and it's also going to have a deregulatory dynamic built into TTIP. So the question is, and this is the final part of my presentation, some of you may be sighing in relief, what is TTIP really about if it isn't about, you know, where it's not going to generate huge amounts of growth, and it's not going to allow the EU and the US to set global standards. So ultimately what we argue in the book is that the bottom line is that this is about, you know, making it easier to block legislation that may impose, or regulation that may impose a cost to business. You know, it's not about directly lowering standards through the trade agreement, although some businesses, of course, would love, you know, to get rid of more stringent regulations on, you know, financial services regulation in the United States, or on GMOs or genetically modified organisms in the EU. That's unlikely to happen because there's all sorts of entrenched veto points, you know, various points. Whether it's public opposition in the case of GMOs, or the Treasury Department in the United States when it comes to financial regulation. It's not going to happen as a result directly of TTIP. But what we argue in the book is that what you have with TTIP also is a series of processes, a series of provisions potentially, which are being contemplated, that would make this an agreement that was living, right? So, you know, living agreement means that the provisions of the agreement, you know, have effects, you know, much beyond the date of ratification. You know, so we're talking about, you know, we're here at the Friuli FutureForum. It's about the future. It's about shaping the future regulatory environment. And here, really, what it's about is making that regulatory environment as you know, more hostile to anything that adds cost to business, anything that gets in the way of the operation of free markets. And so, in the book, we call this, you know, drawing on a lady called Brandon Morgan, we call this the economization of regulatory politics, right? Subjecting, you know, the process of regulating to, you know, increasingly economic metrics, seeing regulation as a potential market failure or a distortion, rather than as a way of protecting people from potential harms. And this, of course, silences alternative modes of regulating. And to get a bit more specific in terms of TTIP, the way in which this is being contemplated is twofold. So the Commission has put forward a proposal for a so-called horizontal chapter on regulation, which would apply, to all areas of regulation in the future, which would have, which envisages, on one hand, increased dialogues between EU and US regulators, so what's often referred to as regulatory cooperation. And on one hand, this would involve a so-called consultation procedure, a so-called something called a regulatory exchange, where regulators in either party could query regulatory proposals that are being put forward, or regulations that are already in force on either side, and ask the other party to clarify, what those mean, and potentially ask for some sort of regulatory approximation between what's being done in the United States or the EU, or vice versa. And secondly, there's a proposal to have a body that would, a so-called regulatory cooperation body, that would sort of oversee this process and try and come up with ways of increasingly eliminating regulatory divergences between the EU and the US. And of course, the problem here is, not that regulators should be talking to each other, because they already do. This makes sense. And if it was, purely about eliminating technical differences in regulation, then that, of course, in principle, would be fine. But what it ultimately is doing is increasingly technocratizing a process which should be, as open and transparent as possible. Right? So that's on one hand, you have these sort of mechanisms which are sort of in some ways biased against more regulation, because the objective is in some ways to eliminate barriers to trade between the EU and the US. And on the other hand, you have a series of procedural disciplines and institutional mechanisms that are intended to constrain regulatory space. And this is referred to in the EU's text as good regulatory practices, right? So it's about making sure that this is our interpretation, it's about making sure that the regulatory process is as business friendly as possible. In three ways. One, it's about introducing greater so-called transparency into the regulatory process. So forcing both parties to increase the information they provide on their regulatory acts. So if, the Italian government or the European Commission is planning a regulation on pesticides, say, it would have to provide early information to stakeholders, business groups and NGOs, and they would have an opportunity to comment. And this, of course, to take comments into account takes time, so it slows down the process. It would have to allow greater stakeholder involvement. So here, in particular, businesses are very keen, of course, to be involved, and they're the ones with more means than NGOs to get involved in these sorts of debate. And the final sort of set of disciplines that TTIP talks about is entrenching the practice of impact assessments, and particularly impact assessments that that consider the impact that regulatory measures have on trade, right? So it's about assessing to what extent a new regulation, say on pesticides, what impact that would have on transatlantic trade. And of course, if it has a negative impact on transatlantic trade, that's also being assessed against its other potential benefits, reducing harm, reducing, exposure to dangerous chemicals. But, it helps tilt the balance in a particular direction. And ultimately what it does is throw a spanner in the process of regulation, slowing it down and exposing it to, lobbying by interest groups. Which is not to say that all this doesn't already occur, but TTIP is about strengthening all of this. And the interesting thing here is that it touches, or it plugs in right into an agenda that's being carried out at the EU level, called the Better Regulation Agenda, or more specifically, the latest iteration of that, which is called the Regulatory Performance and Fitness, or REFIT Agenda, which is the latest initiative in the EU Better Regulation Agenda, and is all about reducing the burden of regulation for businesses. So a target was set, for example, in 2007 to eliminate administrative burdens to businesses by 25% over a 5-year period. And what it's ultimately done is it's led to the entrenchment of these good regulatory practices that I was talking about at an EU level, right? So the European Commission has a series of new impact assessment guidelines, which are all about giving stakeholders an early opportunity to comment on regulatory proposals, entrenching quantitative economic methods for assessing the impact of policies, And it has also established a regulatory scrutiny board, which actually has to give its approval on an impact assessment before any regulatory proposals can be carried forward. So I know this is a lot of, it might seem like a lot of technical speak here, but what, I mean, to sum it up, what all these initiatives are doing is they're introducing something called regulatory chill into the process. So they're making it much more difficult, and they're disincentivizing regulators from taking regulatory action by making it much more difficult to take that action, because to be able to, introduce a new regulation against pesticides, to go back to my earlier example, you have to justify that in terms of impact assessment. You have to gather views from stakeholders. You have to get a favorable opinion from a scrutiny board. And on top of all of that, you also have to allow more comments from your transatlantic partners. And you have to consider the impact that this will have on transatlantic trade. So, a lot of people say that this leads to paralysis by analysis, in regulatory decision making. And it downgrades the importance of other social considerations in regulatory decision making. And it, of course, increases the importance of economic metrics, right? Because that's the way the system is set up, right? It's about, ultimately assessing the economic impact of measures. And so TTIP, what's really interesting about TTIP, and essentially very worrying about TTIP, is that it's very closely linked to this internal EU agenda for regulatory practices. I haven't talked much about one aspect of TTIP, which is ISDS, or the Investor-to-State Dispute Settlement Mechanism. And I won't talk about much about it now. But what I would say is, I welcome any question on this, but what I would say is that it works very much in the same direction as these provisions on regulatory cooperation and regulatory coherence, insofar as it's about limiting the space that government can have to regulate in the public interest, by saying, right, well, we spell out these sets of investor rights, and under these investor rights, if a public policy affects you as an investor in a particular way, you can potentially sue the government for that action. And so it's a way of signaling that the government, in some ways, is not willing to take public policy measures that may have a negative impact on business activity. But we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So just to conclude, as you can see, of course, our argument is not to suggest, this idea that we have the truth about TTIP is not true, right? It's meant to be interpreted in a tongue-in-cheek way, because on one hand, the negotiations are still ongoing on TTIP, and on the other hand, of course, even if TTIP is completed tomorrow, which is not going to happen, of course, it would take many years to figure out what the complete impact of TTIP will be. And even then, we won't completely know, right? We won't know how many regulations are not adopted because of TTIP, because non-decisions, of course, are very hard to measure, right? But what we hope to have done in the book, and what I hope to have done in the talk today, is present you, on the basis of the information that is available, as sort of our vision of what TTIP is. And on one hand, what we say is that the advocates of TTIP are wrong to stress the growth and jobs potential and the geopolitical potential of TTIP. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of the critics are overstating the sort of negative impact of TTIP. In some ways, this is problematic because we find a lot of their arguments do have some resonance. This idea that it's going to introduce regulatory chill into the decision-making process, but ultimately, this is a much more subtle process, and it's not the end of the world as we know it, or at least not in the next 10 years. And we have to be sort of very careful about how we critique them. A final word on something which I haven't had time to talk about today, and that's to say that what we see with TTIP in a more political sense is that actually, even though there's been this move to try and depoliticize regulatory decision making, what you've had with TTIP is sort of an unprecedented interest in trade negotiations, in trade agreements. I mean, I think you guys being here is a testament to that. As I was saying earlier, I was lucky back in the day if I got 5 people into a room who were all academics and trade nerds like myself to talk about trade agreements. And so what you've seen with TTIP actually is a much more greater interest from civil society groups and the public in trade negotiation. That, of course, has put a lot of pressure on negotiators, and it's led to a series of it's actually led to the watering down of some of the proposals for TTIP on issues like ISDS and regulation. And it's led to greater transparency than, I hesitate to say this, than ever before in trade negotiations, at the EU level anyway. Which is not to say that the transparency goes far enough, in my view, and the view of many others, but, it's interesting to note that, for example, now the EU publishes a lot of its negotiation proposals after it's presented them to the United States, and that, of course, makes my job as a researcher easier. But it's also in response to public pressure. If there hadn't been the public pressure, I doubt the Commission would have done that. So, given this sort of politicization of TTIP, I think, it leaves us with, I'm always very hesitant to make predictions about the future because I think the future is inherently unknowable, but I think I'm hedging my bets enough to say that there's potentially at this stage 3 possible outcomes with TTIP. One is that there's no TTIP either because business loses interest because the agenda gets watered down so much that there's not much in it for them, and they're the main drivers of TTIP, large business groups. You already see to an extent that in the case of the United States, where agricultural business interests are very wary of TTIP and the fact that they're not going to get that much in terms of opening of the EU market to their products, particularly on genetically modified organisms. The second one is that TTIP doesn't end up being ratified because there's so much domestic political opposition, although I think that's less likely to be the case. The second one is that you have a TTIP, but with some minor cosmetic adjustments to appease certain aspects of certain factions within civil society, a reform of ISDS like the one that was carried out recently, but it's still a very problematic agreement because it still has that living component still at its heart. That's a potential second scenario. And then the final scenario, which is the one I would hope for, being a broadly progressive orientation, is that you have a radical overhaul in terms of the approach to TTIP, so that this becomes a progressive agreement. It's about harmonizing standards upwards, creating the highest possible levels of protection, highest possible levels of labor and environmental standards being adopted through the agreement. But of course, I think given the way in which this agreement is set up and given the drivers of this negotiation, I think that's probably the least likely outcome. But I guess the fight continues. But anyway, I welcome your questions, and yeah, I'll leave it there.
So we will try to keep that in a very Anglo-Saxon way. So I'm not going to talk for hours. I'm going to just try to sketch out a few points of interest that I pick up from your talk to open the discussion, and then we welcome your question. I think given the complexity of the argument, please do not mind about any type of question or clarification, because even asking question or clarification will allow Gabriel to go more into explaining specific details that he couldn't approach fully in detail. So, there are many things that fascinates me as a social scientist about TTIP, and in particular as a sociologist deeply interested in political economy as I am. So the first thing is about secrecy. Now, so the first question it comes. So how does it compare in terms of how the negotiations have been handled for the TTIP in comparison to the WTO and other types of agreements? Because if I understand well, this TTIP is in a sort of continuation of something that has failed or didn't work in Doha as previous form. So people revamped this idea of free trade agreements in a new and somehow larger form. So this is the things I want to ask you, and because you are an expert on that, I would like to know if the previous agreements were kept so secret as well, or if this secrecy is unprecedented and due to previous failures that negotiators and political decision makers had at the very international. So why this secrecy? Why creating this secrecy around TTIP? Because in a sense, creating this curtain of secrecy, in a sense, push opposition. Because when you don't know about stuff, you freak out about it, right?
Yeah.
It's a classic mechanism. And in a sense, by being so secret about that, you build up social resistance. That's exactly what you don't want in this kind of thing. Second, you told us something about the scenarios, and we always know that when social scientists make predictions, it's always a disaster. But given the importance of the issue, I want to push you on that. And to be honest, this might be my cynical attitude. But the third scenario is really not likely. That we managed to overrun and basically transform this TTIP from a free space for multinational companies into a very good thing to improve standards. It sounds cool, but looking what we see around, it's very unlikely. So what I really want to ask is, how much you think the business are really going to be interested in these things? Really going into the business side. Do you really think that this thing is very useful for business? Then another point, I think it's about the mechanics on how it might work, and this might be more of a sociological question. We know, for example, from the setting up of the European Union, austerity measures, changing to the labor market, that these kind of things hit a specific segments of the population. So I would like you to ask if you can nail down, like, if in your opinion, let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, the TTIP is going to go in the most worrying format, which is scenario 2. So, like, let's say TTIP go forward with some cosmetic changes to make, you know, the social people happy, and then it really goes on. What are the potential consequences, especially for the lower classes, about this specific agreement? And if, in your opinion, there's going to be an effect, and in what we might label, you know, in terms of class effects, so like different effects, a different level of the income and wealth distribution. And finally, and more broadly, how an agreement like TTIP, if it goes into its, you know, most extreme form, might continue undermining the power of nation state, and in a sense the power of politics. Because one very interesting thing we've been talking about, and a lot of people in my university talk about it, like a very famous scholar walking around these issues about the power of inaction. It's like one of the main things about deregulation and, in a sense, neoliberalism after the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s is that people managed to put through a big change in our lives by power of inaction, by making basically the state or the regulator at a higher level being able to impact on certain processes, and in a sense making these people able to make the claim that there is nothing we can do. This is the greatest, you know, when we talk about austerity, we're going to talk about austerity this afternoon, for those of you who will still hear, but like the most striking thing about austerity is that this is presented as the only alternative. Now, as we're going to see this afternoon and this evening, austerity is clearly not the only alternative, and is, you know, in my opinion, a very bad one considering the state of our economy. But the point is how putting together this kind of agreement, which might not have incredible deregulations in itself, might continue to enhance this incredible potential of the power of inaction. So basically making the state or the regulators at the European level useless, unable to intervene, and strengthening the power of big multinational companies that are already very, very powerful. You know, and attached to that, just a very last point, what we can say about small business and big multinational companies. I mean, what I see in this TTIP, I don't see much advantages for small, you know, for medium small companies, and I see advantage for big multinational companies in the most extreme form. So why the hell a country like Italy, which is basically based on small, medium companies, should be so in favor as it is of a partnership trade agreement which is not going to favor our businesses? Like, here is not even a fight between businesses and workers. Here is the type of politics that, at least, you know, for in a pro domo sua kind of vision, doesn't favor Italy at all. So that's why I think that people get very skeptical and buy into conspiracy theory about this stuff, because, you know, secrecy, all these elements, and, you know, who gains from that? If this is gonna come. This is just a brief point. So, like, if you want, I think maybe you can we can collect some other questions that you can go over if you want to react suddenly. I think for questions. So for those of you who have a very good command of English, like if they ask the question directly in English, I think it would simplify our lives. However, for those who don't want to ask questions in English, you can ask in Italian, and I'll probably, like, if you talk very slowly, I think Gabriel can understand. But if Gabriel has any issue with that, you just, you know, I might just step in to clarify.
Don't take it personally if I don't understand your question in Italian right off. But if you speak slowly, I will do my best.
Yeah. Okay, so the mic is coming, and I think it's better. And I think it's much better if we go for 2 or 3 questions, and I really like if I can ask you to be very Anglo-Saxon, so ask questions. So, like, you know, just go very straight to the point. We collect 2 or 3 questions and then give to Gabriel the possibility to react in order to make him having longer and more organic interventions. First, it's no, the lady here.
I thank you, and
there's the lady first.
C'è
la signora prima. Vabbè, fa secondo.
Yeah, I thank you, and I have to thank you, the teachers who took here these splendid young people. First time that I see so many people, young people here in this traditionalist structure. Well, I'm contrary because of the loss in sovereignty of our state. We don't feel well represented by our parliamentary people in Brussels. And we don't feel protected by the people who is treating the tree. And we are really afraid for the health. We are really afraid for the principio di precauzione, come si dice?
Precautionary principle.
Yeah. That is not applied in the United States, for instance. Well, we have many reasons to be afraid of this treatment and don't believe that it will be. You have to know one of the last Ministry of Agriculture few days ago told to us that we don't be afraid. He's in the parliament in Brussels, and he told us simply that we have not to be afraid just because the thing will be very, very slowly. And so we have all the time to resist to it. So this is one of our best parliamentary in Brussels thinking. Thank you.
So there's the lady there.
Io parlo in italiano perché il mio inglese
Parli piano.
Sì, mi presento, mi chiamo Emilia Comando e sono la coordinatrice del comitato Stop TTIP di Udine. E abbiamo una sessantina di associazioni aderenti e circa 350 sostenitori. Siamo in collegamento con Trieste e con Pordenone, dove sono nati pure 2 comitati. Noi siamo tra gli oppositori al trattato, non siamo assolutamente possibilisti. Il trattato si presenta come un trattato che procede a una deregolamentazione, che vuol dire violazione delle tutele di cui godono i cittadini europei nei diversi campi, perché le 2 legislazioni americana ed europea sono completamente differenti. E intanto citiamo degli esempi sul principio di precauzione, è il principio per cui tutti i prodotti o le opere pubbliche hanno un controllo in Europa a monte e vengono monitorate durante il percorso. In America invece il controllo avviene solamente a valle e solo quando le vittime di alcuni settori, penso per esempio a tutte le intossicazioni alimentari, dove si parla di 48 milioni di intossicazioni in un anno di persone, quindi vuol dire 1 ogni 6 abitanti, con 3.000 decessi nell'ultimo anno. Allora, che cosa vogliamo? Togliere le regole, questa cooperazione normativa, l'adeguamento delle regole. L'ultimo incontro che noi abbiamo avuto, abbiamo parlato di OGM e salute. Non si parla solo di OGM, ma come diceva prima il relatore, si parla del cloro nel lavaggio dei polli, ma si parla di ormoni, di carne agli ormoni. Si parla, il settore degli OGM è legato all'agroalimentare, cerco un attimo proprio di dire, e qui si presentavano delle possibilità anche di vantaggi economici per alcune aziende. Qua siamo in ambito Camera di Commercio, quindi è legittimo affrontare questo discorso, ma con la scomparsa delle IG, delle indicazioni geografiche di provenienza e delle DOP, in pratica quelle che da noi sono le etichette. In America si può definire parmesan se si firma un brevetto, anche un attaccapanni, cioè non è detto che sia il parmesan, il parma, il gorgonzola siano i veri, gli originali.
Sorry if I step in just a second. You got
Yeah. We're on GIs.
Quindi
Okay, good.
il sistema del marchio americano non è equiparabile alle nostre etichette con le segnalazioni. Noi corriamo il rischio sì di esportare una maggiore quantità di prodotti, però che si trovano, se non sono protetti, si trovano nelle grandi catene commerciali sia in America che in Italia, perché il fenomeno accadrà vicendevolmente, e squalificati di fronte a dei prodotti che costano meno ma che possono essere di plastica. Per di più andrà in sofferenza per i produttori anche tutta l'esportazione del latte in territorio europeo, quindi con un rischio di nuovo di invenduto e di quote latte. Allora, scusate se mi devo dilungare con gli esempi per far capire, ma che cosa andiamo a rischiare per la vatte dell'ambiente? Ma la Vattenfall è uno degli esempi più famosi, società energetica svedese, subisce, in pratica attacca, scusate, la Germania perché in seguito a un trattato bilaterale con clausola IS dimesse, questa dei famosi tribunali, la Germania viene portata in contenzioso e deve pagare perché aveva organizzato dei controlli sulle acque che vengono scaricate dalla centrale a carbone, un contenzioso, e un altro perché, sempre con la Vattenfall, perché la Vattenfall protesta per le politiche energetiche alternative della Germania. Noi in Italia abbiamo 3 cause ISDS, cosa vuol dire? Che le multinazionali stanno portando in causa gli stati qualora gli stati non garantiscano i profitti delle multinazionali. Non si sa dalla nostra stampa che noi abbiamo 3 cause in corso, sempre relative al fatto che l'Italia ha dato degli incentivi per il fotovoltaico. Quindi noi abbiamo degli investitori che hanno già citato in causa lo Stato italiano. La deregolamentazione del lavoro, perché non se ne parla qui? Noi in Camera di Commercio non è che dobbiamo fare solamente il discorso
No, signora, signora, questo non glielo lascio dire, perché si vede che non ha ascoltato quello che ho detto.
No, ma benissimo.
Beh, deregolamentazione del lavoro, dopo tutto quello che io scrivo sulla deregolamentazione del mercato del lavoro, non ci può certo accusare. No,
allora la Veolia che cosa fa?
Lei è libera di dire
Sì,
quello che vuole,
concludo,
però no. Però quello che secondo me dovremmo cercare di evitare è dire che siccome siamo in Camera di Commercio non parliamo di regolamentazione del mercato del lavoro.
Stavo finendo, dicevo che tanto più interessa la Camera di Commercio perché non deve, c'è il problema della deregolamentazione. La Veolia francese che ha avuto in appalto lo smaltimento dei rifiuti ad Alessandria d'Egitto ha citato in causa l'Egitto perché l'Egitto ha alzato i salari minimi. Quindi è un aspetto che tocca anche le nostre imprese e il nostro settore industriale. È un attacco ai diritti. Allora, scusate, perché adesso la mia domanda, chiudo perché voglio fare una domanda.
Finalmente.
Come mai, sì, ma scusate, come mai non si usano, come mai non si usa, per esempio, invece di creare questi tribunali, che sono dei tribunali privati, degli arbitrati privati, perché non si usa la giustizia ordinaria? Perché eventualmente, se dei procedimenti ci devono essere, non devono essere bionivoci, cioè se le multinazionali possono fare il ricorso agli stati, perché
Signora,
gli
però,
stati
scusi, sono
non
7
possono
minuti,
fare,
deve dar diritto anche agli altri di parlare.
non possono citare in giudizio le multinazionali?
That's,
Shall we take just another one?
I'm happy to take another one.
Yeah. So another question. Yeah. Yeah. There is the young. Yeah. Let's give the right to the young people first. Then. Yeah. Let's.
So I'll keep it short. So
We will get more question if we manage to give question to around a minute, we will manage to have more people speaking. If we don't, we will not.
Ok, cosa?
Very simple.
Ok.
I will be very short and British. Who is who will choose the arbiters in these kind of trials?
Okay.
So go on, answer. Like
Okay.
answer bits of things.
Okay, all right. Well, I've come up with a list of topics. So, because a lot of questions were raised, a lot of issues were raised, and so some things may speak directly to certain individuals, but some common themes did emerge. So, let me start with the issue you raised, Emanuele, about secrecy. And in some ways, you know, the reason these negotiations seem so secret is because they're more in the public eye than trade negotiations in the past. And I think when the Commission comes out and says these are the most transparent negotiations ever, I don't think it's lying. It's just one of the things it says which are least contentious in my view, because it's true. It's it's the first time the Commission has published its proposals during an ongoing negotiation. The actual proposals it puts on the table during the negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everything is visible. Not all its proposals are visible, and in particular, US proposals aren't visible. And neither is the so-called consolidated text of the agreement, which is where the negotiators put together their texts and bracket areas where they disagree. So there's still a long way to go. But actually, the secrecy surrounding these negotiations is a product of the sort of general modus operandi of negotiations like this, and B, it's a sign that civil society groups have been successful at contesting the secrecy by saying, "Oh, look, this is something problematic." And so, yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it's more transparent than previous negotiations. But you're right, it has in the past created opposition, and actually, some of the biggest supporters of TTIP have said, actually, why not make a lot of these documents public, because then people will see that it's not, what they say is going to happen. And this is why talk about chlorinated chickens and so on is sometimes unhelpful, because actually it doesn't say in the text that the EU is going to allow imports of chlorinated chicken. It's much more subtle than that. So, yeah, I mean, the Commission has also seen this way, this release of documents as a way of, waging the PR war. So, it's definitely part of it. The second issue I wanted to address was the issue about scenarios. And your question, I think, was, the third scenario not being very likely. Of course, we do say that in the book, but we don't, in a sense, that's prompted by us sort of trying to make the argument that, well, it's all good and fine opposing TTIP, and I think, myself, I would oppose TTIP in the current form it's currently being envisaged. But you need to sort of, what we want to try and do is channel all that progressive energy into creating a more just trading system. Because if you just oppose TTIP, then you're left with all the inequities that currently exist and all the sort of domestic policy agendas that feed into TTIP. They're continue, as they go. It's obviously good if TTIP is defeated, but that's in its current form. But where does that lead? And so your question was, is it useful for business? What is useful for business in a progressive TTIP scenario? Is that right? Well, I mean, if you reduce business costs by harmonizing standards upwards, and that is, a good thing. I mean, if you look at the European single market, a lot of people have talked about social dumping in the context of the single market, and then that's all good and fine. But when it comes to, for example, environmental regulation, the fact that there was a single market and a process and a push from businesses towards harmonization on an EU level, it actually led to the establishment of higher environmental standards and even higher food safety standards. So actually, economic integration, when there's a political project behind it, can lead to sort of socially progressive outcomes under certain conditions. So I think that's what we sort of would like, a sort of political transatlantic market. But I think that's probably very unlikely. But in theory, business would have something to gain from it. On the issue of non-decisions, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is about governments in some ways deliberately tying their hands and saying, well, we can't do anything. Establishing processes that make it more difficult for them to act contrary to the interests of businesses. And this leads me straight on to your question about small and medium-sized enterprises, which now are very heavily. Obviously we're here in the Chamber of Commerce of Udine, so this is SME central, right, for the region. The Commission is very keen to try and get narratives from small and medium-sized enterprises about how great TTIP will be. There's all sorts of case studies and that they sort of like to talk about. I was in Denmark for 6 months this year, and the one company they like to talk about made trolleys for cake. Yeah, I'm being told to speak slower. I'll speak a bit slower. These examples are always floated, and it's fair to say that companies that are already exporting or that potentially are outward oriented may well gain from eliminating regulatory barriers. But there's two things to remember. One is that SMEs, on the vast majority of SMEs, don't export. It's 87% don't export on an EU level, I think. I don't know what the percentage is for Italy. And the second thing is that TTIP, in some ways, the big political, impetus is not coming from SMEs, it's coming from bigger firms. And so the SMEs that are speaking up in favor of TTIP, in some ways it's because they're being pushed and encouraged by the Commission to do so. In Germany, for example, the association of one of the associations of the small medium-sized enterprises has sort of been very critical of ISDS, for example, because it says that these arbitration tribunals are discriminatory because it's big companies that will have access to them, and not them because they're obviously very costly to access. Which leads me on to ISDS. And one specific question that was asked, and I'll start with that first, is who chooses the arbitrators in an ISDS case? So, very complex area, and it depends what kind of rules you're using. But generally, the sort of standard model as it exists now is that you have 3 arbitrators. One is chosen by each of the parties, so 2 are chosen. So the state chooses one, and then the firm or the investors chooses another. And then the third is usually appointed by mutual agreement between both of the disputing parties. Or in the case of ICSID, which is particularly the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is a World Bank secretariat for managing arbitration. In that case, if there's a dispute, I think you can have the Secretary General of ICSID appointing a final arbitrator. But that, of course, is someone who depends on the World Bank, so there's all sorts of power plays at work there. What the Commission is proposing for TTIP is that you have essentially an arbitration court composed of 5 arbitrators from EU countries, 5 arbitrators from a US nationality, and 5 arbitrators from a third nationality, and they would be appointed by the EU and the US. And then for each arbitration, you would still have 3 arbitrators, but they would be sort of randomly assigned. So the idea would be that you would have, quotation marks, publicly appointed arbitrators deciding on cases. But of course, the pool of arbitrators is somewhat narrow, and a vast majority of cases are decided by a very small number of arbitrators. So it's a very closed system, lots of revolving doors, etc. So, to the extent that that solves the problem, I mean, I'm not sure that would necessarily solve the problem, of potential bias. I mean, let's not forget that actually the only people who are able to bring claims are firms, which is of course not to say that investors are the ones that always win the claims, but it does introduce an element of systemic bias that you don't really have. But you don't, in theory, have in state judiciaries, right? Because there you have tenured judges. And this isn't fully a system of tenured judges. This is still a fairly ad hoc system where most of the fees, most of the money earned by arbitrators, even though they would be paid a retainer fee, still come from the arbitration cases they bring forward. So the question I think you asked was, why not use the state judiciary? And so the argument that firms and investors and negotiators make is that, well, the state judiciary is slow, it discriminates in favor of domestic investors against foreigners. And these arguments may have had some resonance in the context of the sorts of bilateral investment treaties that countries like Italy would generally sign with developing countries. But I think it's fair to say that in the EU-US context, while there may be sort of complaints about the slowness of the judiciary in certain EU member states and certain US states, I think it's fair to say that there isn't a sort of systemic problem of discrimination against foreign investors, right? I think everyone's in the same boat when it comes to, certainly in my country, in Spain, the judiciary is generally acknowledged to be somewhat inefficient. So why should companies have special rights to bypass that? Surely the argument should be improving the domestic judiciary rather than, bypassing. But the reason for bypassing it is quite simple, and it's that, these sorts of ISDS tribunals give a systematic advantage to foreign investors. The system has been explicitly designed to give special advantage to foreign investors because of the systemic bias in the nature of arbitration decisions, the way in which investor rights are very clearly spelled out, but their obligations are not, the way in which the system makes it easy to challenge public policies relatively. And although all of this is being tightened with the Commission proposals for a reform of ISDS, it arguably doesn't go far enough. And then finally, a lot of you mentioned the precautionary principle. I think Emilia, you mentioned it, the gentleman here mentioned it. And that's, of course, one of the contentious issues. And what I would say is one small clarification, which is to say that actually it's not the case that the EU or the US, that the US doesn't have precautionary elements in its regulation. In fact, in some areas, you could say that actually the US is more precautionary when it comes to the regulation of financial services, for example. The US system is somewhat more precautionary. Somewhat more advanced in terms of its regulation. You know, in some ways, you know, even in food safety, for example, you know, the US usually bans the sale of cheeses made with raw milk, right, on public health grounds. You could say that's done on a precautionary basis. But I think what's fair to say is that the intention of TTIP is certainly to eliminate precautionary decision making or minimize the impact of precautionary decision making and emphasize a much more science-based risk assessment. So the idea is that, you know, you have before you just to draw a very crude picture, the whole idea of the precautionary principle as it applies to the regulation of food safety or other risks is that, you know, you essentially, the burden is on you to show that something, as a producer, to show that something is safe before you're able to produce it and market it. Whereas in the case of science-based risk assessment governance, the onus is on you as a regulator to show that something is dangerous before you ban it. So this is very crude, but this is essentially the distinction. And of course, you know, when you're introducing quantitative impact assessments into the regulatory process, what you're doing is essentially you're moving more towards science-based models, because that, you know, that allows for a much clearer indicate. You know, it's quite obvious, right? If you're asking someone to assess clearly the impact of a particular regulatory measure, if you say, well, there's some uncertainty about the effects of, I don't know, climate change, so maybe we shouldn't act because it would impose a huge economic cost, and the benefits of acting are uncertain, then you can see how in some ways it's biased. I'll leave it there, so I'll have some more time for questions.
Allora, su questo ultimo passaggio sull'eliminazione del principio di precauzione sarebbe opportuno parlarne un po' meglio dopo. Prima vorrei fare delle domande. Innanzitutto, immagino per brevità, poi non si è potuto parlare, comunque non si è parlato degli altri due accordi importanti che ci sono, perché si è parlato dell'accordo America-Europa, TTP, ma ce n'è anche un analogo che è già partito sul versante del Pacifico con Australia e tutto il resto, e poi mi sembra che ce n'è anche un altro in discussione, quello sui servizi. Comunque, quindi gli accordi sono tre, quindi forse non è solo un problema di standi prepararsi allo sviluppo della Cina e dell'India. Tu hai detto giustamente prima India, poi Cina, hai ragione su quello. Quindi non è solo un problema geoeconomico, ma forse è un problema geopolitico, nel senso che ci sono anche altri due attori che investono tutta la storia del Novecento, che ci sono da considerare in questi giochi, che sono anche Russia e Germania. Per cui vorrei che, anche a beneficio del pubblico che è fatto, soprattutto da giovani, che dovranno anche affrontare gli effetti, le conseguenze, gli effetti di questi accordi, lei inquadrasse anche appunto sotto questo punto di vista geopolitico, ma marcando soprattutto l'aspetto politico, ecco, di questi accordi, che mi sembrano più che altro, alla fin fine, almeno dalla mia lettura, più che un prepararsi all'avvento dei paesi emergenti, soprattutto un modo per garantire ulteriormente la leadership e la rendita degli americani sul mercato mondiale. Ecco, questo è un primo aspetto. Dopodiché, sempre a beneficio dei giovani più presenti, vorrei che lei evidenziasse su due mercati gli effetti di queste deregolamentazioni, queste armonizzazioni, come dice lei, quello della sanità e salute, quindi dei servizi della sanità e salute, visto che dal medico ci dovremmo andare tutti, anche i giovani in futuro, visto quello che prepara sul fronte ambientale e alimentare proprio questo tipo di deregolamentazione, e il mercato del lavoro. E ultima cosa, le chiedo di fare degli esempi, siccome di arbitrati internazionali ce ne sono già stati, e sono andati con Australia, col Venezuela, arrivati anche a a risultati concreti, ecco, fare degli esempi di dove si è arrivati, perché l'arbitrato ormai è chiaro anche per il diritto civile italiano, garantisce solo il più forte, cioè chi può portare avanti il gioco a tempo quasi indeterminato e qui anche se sono degli stati a opporsi a delle multinazionali, di fatto il gioco più facile ce l'hanno le multinazionali. Ecco, quindi ripeto, India, Cina, Russia, Germania, due mercati del lavoro, due mercati in particolare, sanità e salute e mercato del lavoro, e poi esempi di effetti di azionate reali.
Accogliamo qualche altra domanda?
No, ma è meglio che le raccolga perché sennò non facciamo parlare.
Volevo soltanto chiedere un'integrazione alla libera circolazione delle merci, cioè dopo l'abolizione dei dazi e la riduzione o abolizione del barriere tecniche, ci sarà anche l'abolizione delle formalità doganali di importazione e di esportazione, in maniera tale che ci sia una libera circolazione transatlantica delle merci, così come c'è la libera circolazione intracomunitaria delle merci. Grazie.
So basically the question was if this TTIP is going to favor also the end of tariffs, basically making a common market between EU and the US as it is today.
Market for tariffs.
Yeah. So if tariffs are going to go down, and you envisage an evolution similar to the EU market. And it's also emphasizing that if there would be controls, like if there would be real borders to check them.
Okay.
Yeah. Sì, io sono d'accordissimo nel diminuire la burocrazia, però vorrei capire, ad esempio, nell'agroalimentare, gli imprenditori medio-piccoli italiani che tipo di benefici potranno avere? Come? Nel senso che, visto che dopo oltre 20 anni già all'interno della comunità europea l'armonizzazione degli standard non esiste, perché gli imprenditori italiani devono sottostare a delle normative molto più stringenti rispetto ad esempio a paesi europei come Olanda, Germania, eccetera, vedesi burro, latte, olio, eccetera. Quindi che tipo di vantaggio? Come faranno? Riusciranno a competere con dei prodotti di società straniere, americane o altro? Grazie.
Just another one if there is, otherwise Gabriel can go on and answer. So like you could take down and then we see if there is any further.
Yeah. So this is much clearer. I can answer in turn because there isn't that much overlap. So let me begin with you. Some very interesting questions. So focusing a bit more on the geopolitics of it, and let's not forget that I think it was a line attributed to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State that TTIP was going to be an economic NATO, right? It's a way of strengthening the transatlantic alliance. And I think the context of this was obviously worsening relations with Russia, and it's often made this geopolitical argument in the context of worsening relations with Russia, particularly with a view to energy security. Right? And the idea would be, for example, that as a result of TTIP, the United States would be able to export large amounts of shale gas to the EU, and of course that would make it a lot less dependent on exports of shale gas. So two things here. First of all, the US recently lifted its ban on exports of fossil fuels. Before there was a ban, which was only if you had a free trade agreement, the US could export those sorts of materials to you, but that ban has been lifted. And the second thing is, of course, that argument depends on you and Europe having the appropriate infrastructure to be able to import large amounts of gas, and that would have to be built in the first place. And there are studies of this which suggest that actually, it would be very difficult to realize or to become more independent of Russian gas imports as a result of a TTIP. So on that level, the geopolitical argument is also a bit problematic. The other thing I would say here is, of course, that I think having a sort of discriminatory trade agreement like TTIP, of course, antagonizes the likes of China and India, it is problematic as well if we consider the fact that TPP is very much the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that you were talking about is very much another attempt by the United States to ostracize China. So, as someone who generally believes that economic problems, of a global nature and an interconnected, interdependent world are better solved through multilateral cooperation mechanisms, I obviously see this as problematic. And so, of course, I think geopolitically speaking, this is also not particularly desirable because it leads to a fragmentation of governance on a global level. That in itself is problematic. So you asked me about the specific effects of TTIP on two issues, on healthcare systems and public health, and on the labor market. And I should premise this by saying that of course we don't have the agreement yet, so it's impossible to do anything but to think in a very broad sense about what the effect will be. But to give you the example of public health, what we've been seeing actually is that one of the NGOs I work very closely with is a public health NGO in Brussels, and what they're very concerned about is that these regulatory cooperation and coherence mechanisms will make it much more difficult for them to come to the Commission and try and push it in the way of regulating introducing new regulations on public health. So the big issue right now in Europe in public health is so-called non-communicable diseases, right? So diseases that are caused by what are often called lifestyle choices, but arguably are the result of excessively lax regulations on things like, this might not be a popular thing to say given viticulture in this region, but alcohol consumption, tobacco consumption, and the consumption of unhealthy foods, right? And generally the emphasis in Europe, and in the UK in particular here, has been on self-regulation, the industry itself, self-regulation, apart from tobacco maybe, but certainly in alcohol and unhealthy foods, the emphasis has been on self-regulation by the industry. The industry has been very successful at blocking, moves at improving, more and regulating consumption of these goods. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there was recently a policy introduced in Scotland to introduce a minimum price on alcohol, right, per unit of alcohol, right? And this is generally seen as a very successful way of cutting down on alcohol consumption. And this was challenged actually by the Scotch Whisky Association in court, and the European Court of Justice gave a ruling that challenged the Scottish government's minimum pricing policy on the grounds that this was, infringing on the single market. So, TTIP and these regulatory cooperation mechanisms, again, allow not for these sorts of legal challenges necessarily, but they make it much more difficult to sort of potentially, challenge the power of these powerful industries. So, that's on one side the issue of public health, and then on health systems, I didn't talk much about it, but there is a liberalization of services that is envisaged as a result of TTIP, and this is not so much about privatizing healthcare systems throughout Europe from the top down via TTIP, but it's about enshrining existing levels of privatization that may exist in healthcare systems. So I'm afraid I don't know about the Italian healthcare system very much. What I do know is that in the context of Britain, what's often talked about is that actually the recent moves to marketize the healthcare system and allow private contractors to bid for public healthcare contracts, those sorts of rights would be more protected potentially under a TTIP. It would be more difficult to reverse in future. So, those are two examples, I think, which give an indication of the direction of travel with TTIP. And then the effect.
Sorry, Gabriel, about the healthcare system. So basically, in Italy, actually, we have a higher risk than in the UK, probably because our healthcare system is way more open to market than it is in the UK. So while in the UK, the private spending and the activities that can be run by private actors into the healthcare system are very little. In Italy, they are much larger, and there is quite more of a gray area that could be exploited. So actually, for Italy, the risk in terms of the healthcare system, as it is, because in the UK there is also a lot of talk about heavily reforming the NHS. But if we assume the NHS will keep being as it is today, and the Italian system keep pretty much being as it is today, actually with lowering the standards and opening more to partnership and having actors also from the US coming to provide healthcare services in Italy. In Italy, we're probably a higher risk than there is in the UK in terms of lowering the standards. But this is, again, this is all conjectural, as you're saying, because it's very, very hard to make a a direct connection between these factors. Certainly, these things on the labor market and the healthcare, it's an element of heavy worry, especially in countries like Italy, with respect to norms. Is very often not guaranteed already.
So, and then the effect on labor markets, and here, you know, the effects is a twofold. On one hand, we were talking earlier about the sort of, in some ways, distributive impacts of TTIP. You know, which sectors would win and which would lose. I mean, and here what I would say is any sort of measure that liberalizes international trade is likely to lead to a disciplining effect of labor markets, insofar as it makes it easier for companies to relocate production. Right, and so you know, a lot of the stories that people have. I mean, there are other books on TTIP, I should say, and particularly in German. And you know, they're very. You know, one of the books I read recently talked about, you know, how this TTIP is going to allow massive relocation of production to, you know, U.S. states in the South in particular that have very lax labor protection laws. You know, laws that, you know, make it easy to ban trade unions and so on. I mean, what I would say here is two things. One is that, you know, in terms of, you know, relocating production, I don't think TTIP will lead to massive relocation of production. It really is more about the standards that exist to regulate goods and services. But likewise, that's actually where the main risk, I think, comes for labor standards, because these are potentially a barrier to transatlantic trade and investment. So, you know, these, you know, if an EU government, I mean, because labor rights are generally at the nation-state level, you know, if an EU government is introducing a new sort of labor law, and let's face it, it's going in the wrong direction probably at the moment. But if there was a sort of a move to improve labor rights and to strengthen employee protections, you know, that could be queried by, you know, U.S. regulators, you know, and it's not to say that legislation would necessarily be blocked, but you know, the processes instituted through TTIP would certainly not make it easier to improve employee protection. Certainly. And then you had a question also about real-life examples for ISDS, right? Because I've been talking very much in the abstract. Emilia, I think, had a few examples, Vattenfall and so on. The recent case that was recently concluded was the Philip Morris case, which involved, of course, Philip Morris suing the Australian government over its plain packaging laws for tobacco, for cigarettes, well, tobacco in general. And what's particularly egregious about this case, which is why it's probably not a good example to use in the TTIP case, is that what Philip Morris did was it flipped its investment. So what it said was that it was no longer domiciled in Australia, but it said that, you know, its headquarters was in Hong Kong, which made it a foreign investor, which was able to avail itself of a bilateral investment treaty between Australia and Hong Kong, right? So what is, I think, somewhat clear in the case of TTIP is that that sort of practice would be very difficult to do. It would be very difficult to sort of forum shop in quite as egregious a way, right? But it would still allow companies that have, you know, most multinational companies often, you know, will have substantial investments in the EU and in the US. It will still allow them some flexibility to, you know, use these sorts of provisions. Another case I think that Emilia mentioned was the case of Veolia suing the Egyptian authorities over the minimum wage that was introduced in Alexandria, right, for refuse collection workers. And what I would say here is that, you know, in theory, I mean, it's hard to predict, you know, to what extent, you know, businesses will be able to use these sorts of provisions. But in theory, a business could use an ISDS provision to sue a government if, you know, any level of that government takes a particular policy decision that that business interprets as a violation of its rights as an investor. And these rights are generally come under two headings. One is something called the right, the rights to fair compensation under expropriation. So that's both direct expropriation, where a government seizes your assets. This may happen, and, you know, I think it's probably fair to say that that investor should be compensated. But it's the more controversial type of expropriation is something called indirect expropriation, where a government takes an action which is deemed to be equivalent in effect to an expropriation. So, in the case of the Philip Morris tobacco case, the complaint was based on the fact that, you know, the Australian government had expropriated Philip Morris for its intellectual property by forcing it to use plain packaging. Right, so you know, it's how much leeway you have under those rules to sue government policies, and the language has been tightened in previous bilateral trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, it was treaties. It was very vague what indirect expropriation was, and that of course allowed for much more leeway in terms of interpreting that. Now there's sort of a provision saying that measures to protect public safety, public health, etc., are, or to serve some sort of legitimate public purpose, are excluded from the definition of indirect expropriation. But I don't want to get too technical, but there's all sorts of loopholes around how you define that, and ultimately it's the arbitrators that make this decision. And the second form of investor right is this thing called fair and equitable treatment, which is this idea that an investor has the right to be treated fairly and equitably. And this is actually the standard of investor protection that's most often used. And so if the government sort of takes a public policy measure and the company turns around and says, hey, I was promised that you wouldn't do this, and it was a vague promise, it wasn't even written down, etc., that could be seen as a violation of fair and equitable treatment. But in theory, if it's not defined very clearly, any sort of public policy measure, all sorts of manner of public policy measures have been seen as arbitrary and unfairly discriminating against foreign investors. And ultimately, if these things are vaguely defined, then that gives arbitrators who themselves have a vested interest, broad latitude to interpret things in a way that's favorable to investors. I mean, investors love investor-to-state dispute settlement because it gives them lots of extra rights. So some real life examples. Vattenfall is a case. Philip Morris is a case. Veolia is a case. Metal Cloud in the United States is a case. There's all manner of different cases. The problem is to what extent you can apply them to the current situation, because they are what the Commission is proposing as a system is somewhat new, so it's difficult to tell what the exact effects will be. I think what you can take as a sort of point of summation from all of this is that it's a system that is clearly biased in favor of foreign investors, and I don't think that will change with the current situation. Okay. There's a question about the reduction of technical barriers and about tariffs, and whether what we'll have in TTIP is a sort of single market like in the case of the European Union. What I would say there is I think there will be some reduction of tariffs, particularly on uncontroversial issues. I think the Commission is sort of putting forward a sort of list of excluded products, things like beef, rice, the sort of usual suspects in terms of protected sectors. There is potentially likely to be some reduction of formalities when it comes to certification. So some certification bodies might be considered equivalent. So when you produce a good, it has to be tested, and tested as safe. So there might be some acceptance of an EU certificate in the US or vice versa. But I don't think it's going to eliminate customs checks. I mean, even in the EU, you still have customs checks, right? Between even though you go through the Blue Channel. I went through the Blue Channel at the airport yesterday coming from Britain. I still went. There was still a gentleman there from. I know you don't have a customs authority, but I think it was a carabinieri. So it certainly won't eliminate customs controls, because it isn't a single market. It is still a free trade agreement, and it is more limited in terms of what's being envisaged. So there will still be real borders. Even within the European Union, we're seeing the reassertion of national borders for in some ways, this may well be the beginning of the end for Schengen. So no, I think borders will still be very relevant. And I think there was a question here from this gentleman about the benefits for agricultural SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And so, some of the examples the Commission has used, which are probably genuine examples, is of agricultural producers able to export more to the United States. But what I would say here is a couple of things. First of all, it's fair to say that the U.S. market or U.S. agricultural producers are produced at a higher volume, so they have much higher economies of scale. So on that grounds alone, it makes it more difficult for lower end producers to compete. But of course, in the Italian case, the production is of high end goods, right? So there may be some producers who gain, but what Italian producers are saying is that that actually depends on protection of geographical indications, right? That's the sort of umbrella term for things like protected denominations of origin, Parmesan cheese or Parma ham or whatever. And it's fair to say that the United States is certainly not very keen on extending GI protection to European products. And this is an ongoing battle at the WTO, and the US always talks about its own trademark system. So I don't think that's unlikely. That's not very likely to be resolved. So what I would say is that on the whole, the benefits are marginal. I mean, even if you assume that these gains from TTIP were going to be equally distributed, right? This is €545 per family of four in the EU. Even if that was going to be evenly distributed, which is of course not the case, even that would be, even if every agricultural producer was gaining €2.62 a week, it's hardly very much. And it's fair to say that small, medium-sized enterprises, because they're less competitive internationally often, they often don't produce internationally. Less likely to gain full €2.62.
Is there any other question? Yeah. We need to be brief, so we have only 10 minutes before we have to close down. So if we can, I'll first give space to others, and then
Talk about medicines and the impact on Food and Drug Administration here in Europe. What will happen if during the TTIP, if the Food and Drug Administration starts up bringing medicines into Europe, which perhaps are not allowed now? Another question.
Yeah.
Secondo?
Volevo chiedere due cose, una un po' più generica, che importanza può avere il fatto che lo UK decida o no di rimanere nell'Unione Europea, che se può avere importanza su tutti i tipi, e poi cambiando un po' settore, mi occupo di tecnologie e oggi quando dobbiamo certificare un prodotto per il mercato americano è molto complicato, sono procedure molto lunghe, molto costose. Non so se questo potrebbe facilitare questo discorso, ma per contro diciamo che nel tempo quando brevetti qualcosa lo puoi fare inizialmente per l'Italia, oggi per l'Italia non si fa più, si fa per l'Europa, però poi si possono scegliere anche dei paesi di fuori dell'Europa dove decidere di poter valutare di portare un brevetto. Cosa succederà per tutto quello che andrà in contrasto, per tutto l'esistente che potrebbe generare dei contrasti? E in questo senso un pochino chi fa tecnologia in Italia perlomeno un pochino di preoccupazione c'è.
Is there any other question? We have another one from the top, like, c'è la ragazza prima? Yeah?
You can answer me to read your book, but to have an idea, how can we keep all the positive elements of TTIP? Because I really appreciate your optimistic point of view, but I can't understand how we can really keep only the positive aspects.
Yeah, we have another little one from the. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The third pillar of the TTIP is about environmental sustainability. And the question is, of course, after the treaty, the approval of the treaty, there will be an increase in the trading and in the exchange of goods and traveling of goods. And probably the productions at zero kilometer, it means local productions, will be disadvantaged. So how the environmental aspects of the treaty will cope with this problem?
And then we have a last one, I think, from the first row.
Allora, io più che domande vorrei fare due considerazioni. Benissimo questo incontro per far conoscere anche alla platea più giovane le problematiche che ci sono sotto, che sono tantissime e grosse. Lei ha dato un dato molto importante all'inizio, alla fine ci sarà un vantaggio di 545 euro a famiglia anno, il che lei l'ha giustamente tradotto 2 caffè a settimana. Cioè, è una cosa bellissima, un dato che a me mi mancava, ma la ringrazio per questo perché dà la sostanza della cosa. mentre dall'altro lato, salvo alcune perle che lei ha citato, uno, bisogna garantire i diritti degli investitori internazionali. Ecco, dopodiché bisogna deregolamentare e via dicendo. Quindi noi per 2 caffè settimana anno a famiglia, neanche a persona.
No, a persona, 2
a persona.
Settimana.
Comunque
sì.
600 euro
Sì.
all'anno,
Sì.
dico
Sì.
noccioline, piccolezze, ecco, dobbiamo accettare delle deregolamentazioni che veramente toglieranno comunque delle garanzie che ad esempio in Italia hanno tanti limiti, hanno patologie, tutto quello che va come sul sistema sanitario, perché adesso per curarsi in America, quando tu arrivi in ospedale ti chiedono la carta di credito, chi ti copre, che assicurazione hai. Questo qua non avviene, nonostante tutti i limiti della sanità italiana, eccetera, eccetera. Il film di Michael Moore l'avrà visto anche lei, immagino.
Sì.
E così via. Quindi ragazzi, sappiate che per 600 euro a famiglia all'anno, oggi come oggi, si sta lavorando per limitare i diritti che comunque ci sono, in Italia ci sono, in Europa ci sono, in altre parti del mondo non ci sono. E poi una notazione piccolissima, per onestà intellettuale. Lei all'inizio ha parlato di pollo lavato nell'acqua ossigenata, che è un discorso, dopo ha modificato il discorso pollo lavato nel cloro, che è ben diverso. Quindi parli sin dall'inizio di pollo lavato nel cloro, è una chicca minima, ma dà l'idea, è importante. Dopodiché il mondo andrà come andrà. Anch'io non ho nessuna fiducia, sono d'accordo con lei che lo scopriremo solo vivendo cosa sarà il TTP, il trattato anche transpacifico e anche il trattato sui servizi. Personalmente ritengo che sia nient'altro che un modo per garantire la rendita degli americani come l'hanno avuta nell'arco del Novecento, a partire dalla prima guerra mondiale e soprattutto dalla seconda. Solo quello.
Grazie.
Shall I go for that?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So the question about medicines, and I must admit I'm not the expert on medicines, but there's 2 things here. And it's interesting actually for the NGO I work for. This is one of the areas where TTIP could have a potentially positive impact. And I say potential because there is it's the case that in the United States you have more stringent controls of manufacturing of medicines, and the idea would be to have sort of joint inspections by EU and US inspectors of manufacturing plants in the EU and in the US. Introducing the so-called good manufacturing practices, I think they refer to in the medicine sector. And that potentially brings some benefits because it could lead to more stringent standards and that are harmonized, etc., etc. But the question is, whether drugs companies, of course, will pass on any savings to consumers. They have capital markets. The other issue is intellectual property rights, and of course, in the United States and the EU, you have very stringent protection of intellectual property rights already. But it's fair to say that in the US, they're slightly more stringent. And of course, you have national variation in Europe, and there's questions being raised because, and it's difficult to say because the Commission hasn't actually published its proposals on intellectual property rights. Some stepping in the dark here, but the US, I think, is keen to extend things like data exclusivity, which would make it more difficult to bring out generic drugs, because the data for clinical trials would be kept secret for longer. There's talk about, limiting the degree to which you can have market authorizations under certain conditions, etc. So, there are some worrying issues there. So the question is, to what extent the savings from regulatory cooperation would be passed on to consumers, how big those savings would be. And then there's the question of intellectual property rights. And I think generally, the more you strengthen intellectual property rights, the more costly medicines become. And this is, of course, where the TPP has been very big insofar as it's really introduced much more stringent intellectual property rights protections in countries in the Pacific Rim that didn't have them before, which makes it much more difficult for those governments now to introduce certain types of public health policies. It will certainly raise the cost of medicines for those countries. question, I think, here about Brexit, right? So British exit from the European Union, and how important is this for TTIP? And actually, it's somewhat important because you have two things here to bear in mind. One is that for David Cameron and the Conservative government, TTIP is actually one of the best things about the EU. Like the single market, TTIP is great because it's about deregulation, it's about, you know, increasing business opportunities. It's not about strengthening workers' rights. It's about cutting red tape. You know, the reason people complain, or the reason businesses and the right-wing politicians complain about EU in Britain is because it's a source of red tape, of bureaucracy. You know, and this is a way of eliminating it. And actually, if you look at Cameron's list of demands, one of the demands is to boost competitiveness. He often mentions TTIP as a way of boosting EU competitiveness. So actually, the initiative is seen as one way to keep Britain anchored in Europe. And so, you know, in that way, in some ways, Brexit and the drive towards Brexit strengthens or intensifies or puts greater pressure on people wanting to negotiate TTIP. So that's the direction it's pushing people in. And, you know, one of the arguments that's been raised for Brexit is that, well, you know, all these TTIP negotiations are dragging on. If we were not in the EU, we could sign our own trade deal with the United States, Britain. So yeah, it's certainly a factor in that debate. And then on the issue of technology and certifications in the United States being very costly, and so I mean, I guess here the argument is that TTIP could, you know, help reduce these costly certifications because it would eliminate the need for duplicate certification. You know, and I would say, yeah, this might be a fringe benefit of TTIP for certain companies that export. But, you know, again, even assuming a reduction of NTBs of 50%, you're getting, you know, a couple of coffees a week per person. So, you know, where this certification, you know, and this acceptance of certification doesn't lead to a reduction in standards, you know, I'm not opposed to it. But the problem is, you know, how do you draw the line between that and, you know, accepting standards that are less standard? Oh, I'll give you the classic example here, and this, you know, is often used as an argument for TTIP. But if there had been, if the United States had accepted certification, European certification of car emissions, you know, with the VW scandal, that may have been somewhat problematic, and that scandal may never have come to light if that was the case. So, you know, what I would say is, you know, you have to be very careful and evaluate, you know, things from a holistic perspective rather than just necessarily focus on the extra cost of business. There may be a very good precautionary reason for having duplicate testing, and in this case, for example, it I think had a positive.
Thank you to
I'll leave it there.
Grazie per questo incontro. Lo chiudiamo alle 3, abbiamo l'incontro sull'austerità con il professor Longobardi, la professoressa Mia con Alessandro Arrigoni. Altro punto importante dell'economia di questi tempi, se l'austerità è giusta, se serve, cosa determina, cosa comporta e cosa dobbiamo intendere anche con austerità. A questo pomeriggio e arrivederci e grazie per questo incontro oggi.
Molte grazie.